Today I have the pleasure of introducing a group of top experts to discuss the implications of the Arab Spring on nuclear non-proliferation regimes. The bios are in the book. We're going to jump right into it, and I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Mark Dubowitz.
Great. Well, thanks very much, David. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, Senator Casey and Congressman Royce. I'm grateful for your remarks and your service. We're going to do a topic that's going to sound too technical, a non-proliferation policy in the wake of the Arab Spring. But I want to put this in some human terms. I mean, this is the sum of all fears panel. And I spent the entire night last night trying to think of a way to do this in an entertaining and humorous way. But there is no such way. I mean, this is about weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. It's a serious topic, and we have very serious experts, people who are the leading lights in non-proliferation, and four gentlemen who I've had the privilege of spending the year working with in a project on Middle East non-proliferation. And we're going to have a very detailed report that we're going to be issuing in January, well over 100 pages already, of very specific recommendations on how to deal with this grave threat. Now, we've talked about the Iranian nuclear program, Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons, the implications for the United States, for Israel, for our allies, the possibility of a cascade of proliferation throughout the Middle East, which could lead to multiple Middle East countries with nuclear weapons, all on a hair trigger, where by intention or by accident it could lead to a nuclear conflagration. We spent the morning talking about Syria. This is a Assad regime with one of the largest stockpiles of chemical weapons in the world and biological weapons, a man who has slaughtered 40,000 of his own people and clearly is capable of slaughtering many, many more. And I certainly learned a lot from these extraordinarily smart individuals who are sitting here. One thing I learned just the other day, which I wasn't aware of, actually I think from Orde, is that since World War II, the Middle East has seen more weapons of mass destruction attacks than any other place on Earth. And just to go through the list here, which you may or may not be aware of. Now, the Egyptians used chemical weapons against Yemen between 1963 and 1967. In the 1980s, the Iraqis used chemical weapons against Iranians, and it's reported that Iranians used chemical weapons against Iraqis. In 1987, Gaddafi's Libya used chemical weapons against Chad. And of course, the next year, as most of you remember, Saddam Hussein used mustard gas against the Kurds. And those were the years when the Middle East was stable. I mean, think about that. That was what stability wrought. Well, now we're in the middle of the Great Arab Revolt. And the Great Arab Revolt means that these Middle Eastern governments who brought so-called stability have come down, and now we have political foes who very easily could be at each other's throats. So the stakes are extraordinarily high, and I want to turn right to the panel, to Orde Kittrie, to my right, Mike Yaffe, Sandy Spector, David Albright. They're here in their personal capacities. They are the world's leading lights on non-proliferation, so let's just jump right into it. David, Iran. When will Iran get a nuclear weapon?
It's not inevitable. I think whether they will or not will depend on what we do. And it's hard to gauge when they may decide to try to get a bomb. Certainly the current strategy is to prevent them. Obama administration's made it clear they want to prevent them. Israel's made it even clearer that they want to prevent Iran from getting a bomb and getting a certain amount of nuclear weapons capabilities. I think Iran perceives that it's risky to try to get a nuclear weapon at this time. In a sense, we would at ISIS say they're deterred from trying. We would argue that they would have had a nuclear weapon by now if it hadn't been for all the actions of the international community over the last 10 years. So if they're deterred now, will they be deterred in the future? And we're a technical organization, and one of the worries we have is that if it's easy for them to get a bomb, then they'll be more likely to make the decision to do it. There have been other cases with weapons, acknowledged weapon states, where once they had the capability, the technical capability, the political decision to do so was a lot easier. And in the case of Iran, when we look forward, we worry a lot about the next, particularly a year from now, 2 years from now, where they could, in essence, we use the term dash to nuclear weapons more quickly, maybe getting enough weapon-grade uranium that there isn't enough time for the international community to respond, or their nuclear capabilities are growing so fast that perhaps in 2014 they'll actually have a secret capability, and they could produce weapon-grade uranium in sufficient quantity for a bomb, and we won't even know it happened until they choose to reveal it. So I think they can be prevented. There have been many methods being developed, some by this organization, that have been very creative to keep the pressure on Iran, keep deterring them. But I think in the future, those methods are going to be required to do a lot more in order to prevent Iran from getting the bomb. And I think from us, we often use 2014 as the time when we really need to worry much more, that we won't have the methods in place to stop them from crossing the line.
So David, just to press you on this a bit more, first of all, when in 2014?
Can't say.
Can't say.
I mean, we're not that precise. I mean, and if pushed, I'll say late 2013 and even 2015.
Right.
And I would say the actions today can delay it. For example, you worry about their stock of 20% low-enriched uranium. They're being pressed clearly by Netanyahu's statement, by Israel's statement, to keep that stock below a certain amount. And they may do that. They may decide that, okay, it's not worth the risk to keep letting that stock grow and grow and grow. And if they let it grow and grow and grow, then they can break out more quickly. So I think, again, it's a lot depends on what we do.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what we can do. Orde, I wanted to ask you, President Obama has made it clear that the policy of his administration is to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. And, there's a lot of talk in this town, maybe too much talk, about a policy of containment or of deterrence. Can you tell us why containment or deterrence will not work?
Sure. Thanks, Mark. I think there are three major reasons why you can't rely on deterrence or containment. First of all is the possibility that Iran's nuclear bombs might be used, either because the Iranian regime itself is so messianic as to be undeterrable, or because rogue elements in Iran get hold of nuclear weapons and use them or transfer them. We saw what happened in Pakistan, a relatively moderate regime, where A.Q. Khan got a hold of the nuclear secrets which he had in fact developed and transferred them to a variety of countries. What would happen if you had an A.Q. Khan in Iran who transferred actual nuclear bombs? You also have to worry about miscalculation. People say, well, mutual assured destruction worked between the U.S. and the Soviet Union for many years. Well, if you look at the history, it actually came very, very close a couple of times, particularly on three occasions. One was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Another time was actually, and this is less well known, during the Yom Kippur War. There was a recent article by Abraham Rabinovich in the Jerusalem Post. He wrote a book about this, and he describes how the American and Soviet navies circling during the Yom Kippur War, watching each other, got so tired they almost made a mistake and pulled the nuclear trigger on each other. And finally, just sort of more innocent mistakes. If you look at an example, in the 1980s, Boris Yeltsin was president of Russia. The Norwegians had a weather rocket. They launched their weather rocket sort of in the direction of Russia. They notified the Russians, but this time the notification got lost in the mail. The Russian generals came into Yeltsin, said, look, apparently, somebody has launched something at us across the far horizon. If this is an American nuclear attack, you have 2 minutes to launch, or Russia will be obliterated with no shots back. Yeltsin, thankfully, was sober that day. Relations were good between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and he said, it can't be the Americans attacking. When you talk about the U.S. And Iran, when you talk about Israel and Iran, shorter flight times, more tension, the chances of something going wrong, of an escalation ending in disaster, are that much higher. Finally, you also have to be concerned about Iran with a nuclear umbrella. People say, oh, well, Iran will be more responsible if it gets nukes. Actually, history argues otherwise. If you look at Pakistan, they became much more aggressive after they got nuclear weapons. They started attacking in India, knowing that the Indians wanted to avoid getting into a nuclear exchange. If you have nukes and you're more aggressive than the other guy, you can go farther than you would if you didn't have nukes. It's called the stability-instability paradox, for those who want to look it up. And finally, as was mentioned before, Cascade of Proliferation in the Middle East. The Saudi king told Dennis Ross, if the Iranians get nukes, we will get nukes also. And from there, other countries may follow. And in a country as fraught with tension as the Middle East, you don't want to have a cascade of proliferation.
Okay. So, Mike, I wanted to ask you, just talk about this cascade of proliferation. I mean, in your view, has this great Arab revolt, or the so-called Arab Spring, has it changed the proliferation intentions or policies of governments in the region, for better or worse, or not at all?
I'm not sure I can put an exact sign whether it's better or for worse, but what I can say is that things have improved in the sense that there is more awareness about what's going on, more consciousness of it. Certainly, when you look at the issue of slippage of authorities that have happened in the region, particularly like in the case of Libya, where 15,000 man-pads disappeared from its stockpile, that has caused great alarm about how secure are the stockpiles throughout the region. Of course, we have all been talking about chemical weapons in Syria as another major concern. So in that regard, they are concerned about this. As more testimonial to this, on a sort of a personal thing, is that for the last 3 years, the U.S. Central Command, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and my center, the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, have been co-hosting an annual symposium on countering WMD in the Middle East. The first 2 symposiums were held in Tampa at CENTCOM headquarters. This year's symposium was held just 3 weeks ago in Saudi Arabia. First time any such symposium had been held in the region. The Saudis were very happy to host this as a sign of saying they are very concerned about what's going on in this region. And the concern is not simply on the nuclear level. It is at all the different levels of the weapons of mass destruction. It is on the chemical, it is on the biological, it is on the radiological devices. So there is an increase in heightened concern about this potential threat.
Well, let me ask, Mike, you or anybody to answer this. I mean, do you all agree that a nuclear-armed Iran will lead to a so-called cascade of proliferation? And again, just to put this in layman's terms, 5 nuclear-armed countries, potentially Iran, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, maybe Turkey, nuclear-armed hair trigger, risks of conflagration by intention or by accident. I mean, are we in general agreement? Sandy?
I guess not.
Yeah,
Not
this
general
side
agreement.
is probably not.
I think, and I shouldn't have said it with a smile, because this is a pretty serious business, and there will certainly be pressures and movement in the general direction of creating some type of capability that maybe in the long term might provide access to nuclear weapons. So we're seeing nuclear energy, for example, nuclear power plants are going to come to the region relatively soon if the Arab Spring actually doesn't interfere with those plans, and if the projections that are on the books come to be realized. But if you go country by country and look at precisely what the motivations might be, there are many factors that would lead in a different direction. First, it's very difficult to make nuclear weapons. You run into all of the kinds of problems that Iran is now confronting, both technical and political, because we would certainly push back on any of these states that were seeking to acquire nuclear arms. And moreover, many of these states are very dependent on us. Even Saudi Arabia is dependent on us, really, to protect it right now and to provide advanced military equipment. And that relationship would be completely endangered if they were seen to be moving down the wrong track. I think the same is true for Egypt, maybe Algeria, or whatever other state we might want to identify. Turkey is a particular case. Turkey is a NATO ally. It already is under a nuclear umbrella, and I think we've just reinforced that relationship by providing the Patriot missiles. So, and I don't need the Cascade to get extremely nervous about Iran. I mean, Orde just gave you the briefest, overview of why we're all so fearful. There is much to worry about there, just in Iran per se, and the trouble it can make in the region, the threat that it can provide, it will present to us and to others. So I think, focusing on Iran because of what it can do itself is really the main thing. The cascade, maybe, but maybe not.
Yeah, could I add one
David.
thing? Yeah, let me be a little more pessimistic than Sandy, or just emphasize something different. Proliferation historically has been very slow, and it's if Iran had nuclear weapons, there'd be, I believe, much greater instability. There would also be many more demands placed on the U.S. to keep the others from proliferating. And in that, there may be some slip-ups, there may be some bad moments, and with the growing nuclear capabilities in the region, which I think would be inevitable, you could see countries decide to cross the line. And so there could be, in a sense, surprises in the long term. I think we'll see them coming in the short term, but you could have, just like we've seen, proliferation would just continue. And it may not be a cascade because of countries like the United States, but it may be inevitable.
So I want to just keep the conversation moving on this point. So if we're all in agreement that a nuclear-armed Iran is a serious, grave threat to American national security and the security of our allies, let's talk a little bit about what we can do about it. I mean, we've spent a year, had some real healthy disagreements about some of these questions, but the fundamental question, I think, is in most of the audience's mind is the importance of a credible U.S. military threat. Sandy, how important is it?
Well, I think the way you framed it is something we pretty much do agree on, even though there's some very careful reservations about an actual military attack. The military threat needs to be real enough that it influences the behavior of the Iranians. And we have sanctions, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a second, and we want to intensify those, but part of the package has also got to be this threat that's behind the scenes, but still has a good deal of reality to it. Now, it turns out over the last year, and certainly even before that, there have been many elements that have gone to reinforce the reality of the threat. And there's been a lot of signaling. There was a very large exercise in the Persian Gulf recently. There have been new arms purchases in the region. The missiles have been, defensive missiles have been shared now with a number of states in the region. And frankly, the president's declarations have been pretty explicit. I mean, he was put to the choice of saying, do we want to manage this and just contain the threat, or are we going to prevent it? And he reiterated that. Statements by Leon Panetta, Defense Secretary, have dropped some of the hesitations that were in earlier phrases. And so again, there's been a reiteration of how seriously we take the threat and that we are prepared to act if necessary. I think it's everyone's hope on the panel that we never get to that. But I think the measures that are being taken, and we need more of them, are the ones that make that threat real, and we hope will have some influence. If you go back to 2003 to 2005, when we were in Iraq, with all of the problems that has posed and all the missteps that got us into that war, it concentrated the mind of the Iranians. And that was a period when they actually suspended a lot of their nuclear activities, accepted additional inspections and the rest. So they are susceptible to military pressure, and the trick, I think, for us is to get it right so that you apply the pressure, but you never have to take it all the way to actuality.
So President Obama says, I don't bluff. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei sitting in Tehran, I'm not asking you to read his mind, but do you think we've done all we can to send a very clear message that this is a credible military threat and that we are serious about using the full power of the U.S. government to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons? Have we done enough? And if not, what else can we do? And I'd open it up to any of you.
Well, we've also, just to add to the list, I mean, we've established this, I guess it's a portable sort of naval base in the Persian Gulf proper.
Okay, so you think, Sandy, we've done enough? You think we send a message?
I think you want to continue that type of activity. In other words, we had an exercise 2 months ago. And we had one, I think, maybe 6 months ago. You don't want to stop. That has to kind of continue. And the declarations have been pretty powerful, and those need to continue. So I'm not saying we just sit on our hands, but I think that's the style of activity. It's the reinforcement that we mean business. I think that's what you certainly want to do.
David, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think this is a little bit inside, but Obama administration has said they want to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. But what does that actually mean? Does it mean we have evidence they're bolting the last bolts together for a deliverable nuclear weapon? Does it mean they've decided to make highly enriched uranium going above the 20% level? Does it mean they have too much 20% material and could break out more quickly? So I think there is a real need for trying to define that. I mean, I think in our report we try to do that in a more not necessarily in a red line way, but in a way that the U.S. has to be prepared to be able to make an assessment based on a set of criteria that if Iran meets that set of criteria, or there's a judgment, then the U.S. would respond militarily. And I think right now, I think there's at least what I hear, it's not well defined, and you have Israel taking a very different point of view, where they've said that they may strike militarily when Iran reaches a certain level of nuclear weapons capability. That would be short of making the bomb. So I also think there's a need to reconcile the U.S. and the Israeli points of view and start to build support in the international community. Because in the end, and at my own organization, we will certainly oppose military action. I'll be honest. I'm an outlier in this group in a certain way. I can see how it could happen, but if it does happen, you want it to look more like what happened in 1991 in Iraq. Than it looked like in 2003 in Iraq. And you want to make sure there's a strategy of what happens next, like there was in 91. You don't want Iran rebuilding this program that's just been destroyed. So I think there is a lot of thought that's necessary in order to work out what does it mean to build a nuclear weapon, and two, what's going to come after a military strike to prevent Iran from rebuilding.
Well, or let me ask you this, because Prime Minister Netanyahu made very clear at the UN General Assembly where the Israeli red line is, right? It's spring or summer of 2013. And there is an argument that there is no American red line. There's an American invisible line, and that no one's really sure where it is. Not the Iranians, not us, not the Israelis. Do you share that concern? Is there anything we can do to establish a more conclusive and defined red line, so that it actually helps us in our negotiating strategy with the Iranians? As Ali Elfano reminded us this morning, Persians learned how to negotiate in the bazaar. They're tough negotiators. They understand brinkmanship, but it's hard to negotiate around brinkmanship if you don't know where the lines are. Do we have an American line? Do we need to more clearly define it?
Thanks, Mark. I think there are a couple of major reasons why the credibility of the military threat is so important. One reason is, as Sandy, I think it was, indicated, the Iranians do respond to credible threats of force, right? I mean, you look at the hostage crisis. It resolved when Ronald Reagan was elected. And if you read the biographies of the hostage takers, they say they were afraid he was going to act like a cowboy. So they released the hostages the moment he was sworn in. It's not that well known that Soviets were taken hostage at their embassy at the same time, but the Soviets threatened to bomb Tehran, and their hostages were let go. It's also important to note that the Iran-Iraq war came to an end when the U.S. mistakenly, the USS Vincennes mistakenly shot down an Iranian civil airliner. The Iranians thought, wow, the U.S. is going to get into this war no holds barred. And the Ayatollah made a speech saying he had to drink the poison chalice because the cards were such that he had to simply take the best deal he could. I'm not recommending we bomb Iranian airliners. I'm just saying there's a lesson there, that the Iranians back down in the face of a credible threat of force. At the same time, if you are the Iranians, you are thinking to yourself, well, what can I learn from the example of India and Pakistan? India and Pakistan detonated nuclear bombs. There were some sanctions imposed on them for a while. A few years later, those sanctions were lifted. If the Iranians, you think to yourself, well, all I have to do is get the bomb, test it, there'll be some sanctions, and then I'm home free. You have to make it clear to them that there is no home free the day after, because they're never going to get there. Therefore, they have to cut the best deal that they can.
David, let me cut to you actually, because there's a lot of talk about sanctions, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about sanctions, particularly if you've been to previous FDD conferences. You probably heard all you want to hear about sanctions, particularly from me. But I want to talk about another aspect of sanctions that I think are as important as the economic sanctions, and those are the sanctions that prevent Iran from procuring the essential parts and components for its nuclear program. And so that even in a post-strike environment, if Iran wanted to reconstitute its nuclear program, is it true that it's still dependent on essential parts and components from the West? And do we have a problem with nuclear smuggling?
Yeah, no, Iran wouldn't, without outside assistance, which is ongoing, Iran wouldn't have a large centrifuge program now. It may have a small one, or may have developed a small one over time, but it depended extensively on assistance from AQ Khan, two periods of time when that assistance was provided. They've been smuggling we call dual-use goods that are necessary to build centrifuges and centrifuge plants since the 1980s. They freely will talk about this. Particularly, they talked about it to the IAEA when they were more open in 2004, 2005. And so they're very dependent, and they're active now. There was just another court case, arrest of some smugglers, I guess it was yesterday, trying to buy things here. Carbon fiber. They were looking for what's called a carbon fiber winding machine. And these things are used in missiles, but also in centrifuges to make the more advanced type, which we know Iran is developing. We also know that they're very clever. Europe has tightened up, but they like European and American goods. And they've been working actively in China to buy European, American, Japanese goods. And China is not complicit in it. The Chinese government's not complicit, but it's not doing enough. It's starting to be aware of the problem. And we're thinking that pressure needs to be brought to bear on China to stop, in a sense, it's a transshipment. Goods made in Germany, sold by that company to a Chinese company that it thinks will keep it in China, but in fact it's going to Iran. And we call it a country of transit concern. And we're thinking, well, maybe it's time that China was called out on that. And with regard to Iran, there's implications of that in the Iran sanctions legislation, that it could lead to imposition of additional licensing requirements on goods being sold to Iran, which in essence would serve as sanctions on Iran. But the point is that China needs to be pressured to stop a loophole in the system internationally that's being created to keep Iran from outfitting its gas centrifuge program. And that effort over time has had tremendous success. And with more and more sanctions, it's been more successful. More purchases stopped, more interdictions, and more trouble for Iran to make progress on particularly its gas centrifuge program.
Mike, in terms of U.S. non-proliferation programs, I mean, David is emphasizing some of the holes that exist, particularly in export controls and the lack of enforcement of existing sanctions legislation. What's your assessment of sort of U.S. non-proliferation programs? What more can be done, should be done?
Yeah. I mean, what you heard, at least then, when you hear discussions on sanctions, I mean, those are all the things that we try to do to cut off supply. And so there are more things that could be done to enforce things, to have better training in the region, if you will, for border guards and so on. But we also need to look at the demand side as well. What drives countries to proliferate? And how do you then also build in that notion of a non-proliferation norm? How do you build a community of non-proliferation in the region? And here, the United States has been doing things, and it's been doing some really good stuff, but there could be a lot more that could be done. that we have a lot of programs that are operated throughout the Department of State, out of the Department of Defense, some from Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy. It's not saying that all these things are all working together, that there is a way that there could be more of a concerted action that could be given to this. We need to look at these things and not in just of terms of what the U.S. government could be doing government to government, but how do you build the non-proliferation norm within the societies themselves?
And Mike, let me ask you a really direct question
Okay.
here, because non-proliferation norms, I get that, it makes sense, and we always want government to work better together and be better coordinated. But here's a direct question, and if anybody else knows the answer, please speak up. How much does the U.S. government spend annually in fighting non-proliferation in the Middle East? Right? I mean, again, let's just back up again. This is the sum of all fears, right? This is the Middle East. I think I went through 5 or 6 examples. We're in the post-war period. We've already seen WMD attacks, right, and thousands of people killed. I don't think anybody in this room needs a lesson on the kinds of regimes and the kinds of terrorist organizations
Yep.
that are in the Middle East and that come out of the swamp that is the Middle East. And so I would assume, as a layperson, that we must be spending billions in fighting Middle East non-proliferation. How much are we spending?
You lose that bet. No, I actually, I do not know, because as I explained, these programs are so desperate from one another that nobody really quite knows.
Does Congress know?
I doubt it.
So Congress doesn't know, the executive branch doesn't know, or do you know?
We, as part
Study's
of
been commissioned, so we know.
Yeah. Well,
as
that's
part
true.
of our report, we talked to a lot of people to try and get a handle. We know that overall, on cooperative threat reduction, non-proliferation programs around the world, about $1 billion a year is being spent, most of it in the former Soviet Union. Folks in Congress asked the Congressional Research Service to do an analysis, which was then shared with us. They were not able to get a figure. There's nobody who knows. There's no person who follows everything that is being done with regard to non-proliferation programs in the Middle East. There's nobody who coordinates. There's nobody who looks for overlaps. There's nobody who tracks. So we think somewhere around the figure of $20 million a year is being spent.
Sorry, 20 million with an M.
20 million with an M. The Congressional Research Service analysts spent a lot of time on it. I think it's probably 20 million, give or take 10 million. She wasn't able to tell. And you know, this is a concern. This is an important region with a lot of threat. And for whatever reason, there just isn't a coordinated strategy. And one of the things we call for, and I think Mike talked about this a little bit, is having a comprehensive non-proliferation strategy for the Middle East.
Can I just interrupt here for a second?
Len, by the way, sorry, Len Leader is sitting in the front row. Len was the CFO for AOL for many years. Len, you ran a business, and if someone came to you and said, how much are you spending on a vital element of your business? And you said, look, I don't know, but maybe we should do a report, find out.
I'd pass on that investment.
Right, you pass on that investment. And I don't mean to belittle this, but I think it is worth emphasizing that $20 million to address a significant threat to American security, to the lives of
Mark,
all of us.
it's worth stressing that, in fact, we're spending billions. This is one slice, and I would say it's the soft slice. And I ran some of these programs when I was
We're
in
spending billions
government.
worldwide,
No,
1 billion.
You're spending billions in the Middle East. Every exercise, every military exercise is $100 million probably, or $50 million. Every aircraft that we finance to give to a country in the region is money spent. The bases that we run, the presence that we have in the region, all of these add up, and they are big. How about the intelligence capabilities that we have directed at the Iranian program? That's billions right there. So I think it's, you know, I'm sort of, this is the yin and the yang. You know, for all of you that worry about these problems, you know, the U.S. government is very, very active, and it is not really holding back in terms of expense. They're just spent in other areas. The programs that are trying to build the norms, that are trying to establish codes of conduct, let's say in chemical and biological institutes, that are trying to make sure that nuclear power plants, if they are built, they are safe, they're very important. But the hardcore national security stuff, I think, takes precedence, and that is getting very seriously funded.
Okay. So much time we have, but in terms of hardcore national security stuff, I want to just shift a little bit from this sort of paradigm where we imagine Iran building a nuclear weapon, putting it on a missile, firing it into Europe or Israel, ultimately getting ICBM technology, being able to reach the United States. I mean, this is sort of a classic paradigm. I want to talk a little bit about really the sum of all fears paradigm, which is nuclear terrorism, or WMD terrorism. Or I don't know if you want to comment on what are the risks of, I mean, what are the real risks of WMD terrorism?
Sure. There are very significant risks to WMD terrorism. We all know, about the risks of a nuclear bomb going off, in the port of Los Angeles, killing 500,000 people, et cetera, et cetera. But when you look at chemical and biological, there are also very significant threats there. For instance, you can look at what happened in World War II. The Japanese army dropped infected fleas in China and killed 50,000 people. That's a kind of a bio attack.
With plague.
What?
Plague.
Yeah. Plague-infected fleas. Killed 50,000 people. Chemical weapons, World War I. Right? We're worried about chemical weapons in Syria. World War I, chemical weapons killed at least 90,000 people. And you have these terrorist groups in the Middle East. Al-Qaeda has tried very hard for years to develop WMD. Probably the closest they came was there were a group of retired Pakistani leaders of really the Pakistani nuclear program who teamed up with Al-Qaeda to try and help Al-Qaeda to develop WMD, Wmd Terrorism. Luckily, they were cracked down upon before things got too far out of hand. But that's an example of Al-Qaeda. And you have to worry about potentially Iranian scientists teaming in a similar way. You look at Hezbollah, there are obviously rumors that Hezbollah might get their hands on some of the Syrian chemical weapons, and Hamas has been known to have several times attempted to use cyanide gas in attacks on Israeli civilians. So the question is, what you do about this? What can you do to stop non-state actors such as Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas from getting chemical, biological, nuclear weapons? There are a couple of things. We came up with a list. One thing is, it's interesting. There are a number of fatwas talking about how WMD is proscribed by Islam, and a number of fatwas talking about how it's okay under Islam. One of the things you can do is you can get allies in the Middle East, such as the Saudis, who are close with various clerics, to issue some weightier fatwas prescribing this. The other thing you can do is you can make it very clear that if a state like Syria or Iran, if their WMD ends up in the hands of terrorists, that state will be held to account. And you're not going to wait necessarily for perfect proof. The other thing you can do is obviously improve detection and response. And it's interesting to note in the biological arena that a lot of what you do to improve detection and response with regard to biological weapons is the same things that you do to improve detection and response to just naturally occurring diseases. There's actually a very interesting, talk about unfunded projects in the Middle East. There's an interesting project that still exists, Middle East Consortium for Infectious Disease Surveillance. Partnership of the Israeli government, the Palestinian government, the Jordanian government. Does great work, which is useful in both tracking disease spread and also potentially in tracking and responding to biological weapons attack. That project, a great project, is begging for money. Barely manages to get its basic budget every year. And this is the sort of thing that I think ought to be supported by the U.S. government in a way that it's not. And the final thing that we need to do in terms of non-state actors is, Al-Qaeda came closest to developing WMD when they were in control of a territory in Afghanistan where they had the time and the space, a base to develop WMD. You have to keep groups like that from getting a base.
David, I want to ask you, because Orde's talking about WMD attacks by non-state actors, chemical, biological. I note actually in your bio, besides being a former weapons inspector and a physicist, that you served on the International Task Force on the Prevention of Nuclear Terrorism.
many
And I wonder
years
if you
ago.
could talk a little bit about nuclear terrorism. I mean, David, how likely is it?
Well, again, I'm a scientist, so I think it's a very small probability. I kind of reject the idea of 1%, 50%. I think it's much less than 1, but I would also say the chance of Fukushima happening was also much less than 1%. Chernobyl. So again, from a scientific point of view, it's a low probability, but it's a horrific consequences. And I think as proliferation happens, as nuclear capabilities, civil nuclear capabilities spread, you're going to have more of the kind of the wherewithal for terrorists to exploit, and therefore more opportunities. And I would like to emphasize, though, what was said, that Orde said it, that you have to deny the territory. That's a lesson of Afghanistan. You don't want to give these people time and space to work on these kind of weapons. But that being said, if you look at Sudan, Somalia, I mean, a couple places, it's not an easy thing to accomplish. And I would say that we're not prepared here for a nuclear attack. And I think that's why you have to always worry about it, even though I think you should keep it in proper perspective. But if one happened, how do we know a second's not going to happen? Will our democracy survive if you fear a second? What will we do to the state we suspected that did it? I mean, if you look at the news commentary after 9/11, you heard comments just based on what happened in 9/11 that maybe we should nuke some states because remember at the time Iraq was blamed initially. I mean, can you imagine what will happen if there's a nuclear explosion that goes off in a city? So I think everything has to be done to prevent it. The Mideast is unfortunately is a breeding ground for the terrorists that may do it. And as time goes on, they're going to become more technically capable, which in the past has been one of their stumbling blocks. When I worked on this in this task force, there weren't many terrorist groups that could even think about building a nuclear weapon. That, unfortunately, is changing.
Okay, well, thank you, David. Julia was giving me the death stare, which means that our time is up. I want to tell you that after a year of working with you four, despite the gravity of the threat, I feel better knowing that American national security is in the hands of such experts. Please give them a round of applause. And thank you very much.